Hello, I'm Greg Lindsay. Welcome to the Big Rethink brought to you by New Cities. Today is August 27, 2020. Cases in the United States at this point have crossed over 5.8 million, and total deaths in the United States to date are approaching 180,000. Today I'm joined by West Sacramento Mayor Christopher Cabaldon, who will be joining us very shortly to talk about how his city, West Sacramento, has been weathering the fires, the pandemic, and the impending withdrawal of Uber and Lyft from California due to its dispute with the legislature over labor laws, which of course will deny some mobility services to its constituents. But first, let's get into the news that is. So let's make sure we bring this up to full screen. And here we are. So yes, if you want an image of 2020 in a nutshell, it would be this, of course. California is currently still suffering from the second and third largest wildfires in its history, burning in Northern California, of course. This is an image here from one of the oldest state parks in California, home to majestic redwoods. And here you can sort of see in this time lapse coming from Colorado State University here, the fires as they burn. Images from Napa and elsewhere are, of course, apocalyptic, demonstrating, of course, that those who fled from densely populated urban areas due to the pandemic for the countryside of Northern California are now, of course, fleeing again from the approach of the wildfires, sort of underscoring here what the Atlantic magazine sort of determined as the exponential crises that continue to unfold in the United States. The good news, if there is some, is that some of the redwoods have survived in the park here, charred but not destroyed. But as we can see, the air quality across Northern California continues to be terrible, underscoring again the ongoing health risks in a pandemic that is a respiratory disease. And as always, I've started these new episodes with a sort of discussion of the intersection of climate change and cities. And to me, what I'm looking at these images, it underscores that in combination with COVID, the effects of this pandemic of this time will be felt for decades to come in compounding health crises. We really have yet to even remotely understand exactly what the cost to our cities, our communities, and our public health system will be. But that's not even the top of the news. We'll obviously discuss that with Mayor Cabaldon in just a little bit. But first, of course, is Hurricane Laura, which struck the Gulf Coast yesterday as a Category 4 storm. It diminished, of course, to Category 2 upon arrival there, but striking, in the seam between Texas and Louisiana, less populated, of course, than a strike on Houston or New Orleans, but hitting many of the petrochemical refineries that are there, again, underscoring how the climate crisis is having a direct effect by attacking some of the sites that, of course, are triggering our global carbon emissions. And it's been interesting. Robert Muir Woods, who, of course, is the chief risk officer of RMS, has pointed out that over the last decade or so, the United States in particular has only grown more attracted to the risks of climate change. He calls it risk tropism. And so here what you're seeing is basically the growth in population of counties that are actually nearest the coast. Florida, Texas, California, the already vulnerable areas have only become more vulnerable. And at the same time, the footprints of building in these areas have only become more pronounced. So we're seeing actually larger homes, larger losses that are happening in these various areas. This, of course, has led to the relatively unprecedented step in the New York Times today of showing basically bringing the term managed retreat into the American lexicon. If you may remember the presidential debate season, which of course seems like 1,000 years ago, it was then that billionaire Tom Steyer said the words managed retreat for the first time on the presidential stage. This is, of course, the acknowledgement, belatedly, that basically millions, tens of millions of Americans will have to be evacuated off the United States coast by century's end, whether through carrots or sticks. And already we're seeing that you're basically moving away from individual policies of home buyouts into larger, basically plans to remove people. And this, of course, is going to be a major theme of Higher Ground, which is the conference that I'm planning at New Cities for the first week in December to sort of explore these issues of managed retreat and climate migration. The New York Times also covered getting into the intersection of home wealth, the permanent destruction of home value, and of course race in the United States. As I speak, protests continue to I guess I should say rage, given also the police response in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in the connection there to the most recent police shooting. But there also, we've seen in the New York Times this week here, this is a story about how Black homeowners face discrimination from appraisers. The collective wealth to Black households in the United States, according to the New York Times piece, is more than $156 billion due to appraisers who through their own sort of cognitive biases, effectively mark down the value of their homes. And this, of course, ties into, many of you who are watching this may have seen Ta-Nehisi Coates's, or read it, I should say, the case for reparations, which begins with a discussion, of course, of redlining the United States and the discussion of the destruction of Black wealth, and also, I should ask, of Hispanic wealth in the United States. The financial crisis of 2008, 2009, much like the one we're experiencing now, of course, had overwhelmingly unequal effects on communities of color, and particularly households of color. And so the New York Times, again, drawing attention to this as this continues to unfold. And speaking of inequality, one of the more interesting pieces that came out this week was in the Wall Street Journal by Christopher Mims, who drew attention to the so-called K-shaped recovery. If you know economists, you know that when it comes to economic recoveries from recessions, they love to draw various letter forms to describe what's happening. Is it a V? Is it a W? Is it a U? Is it an L? Well, we have a new one, the K, which of course underscores that for the wealthiest Americans, this has been a time of unprecedented stock recovery. The bull market has returned faster than any sort of recovered market ever. And of course has also been the continued destruction of small businesses in the United States and massive unemployment with looming evictions to follow. Now, Mims pointed out, as has been pointed out by economists like MIT's Darren Acemoglu and others, that basically artificial intelligence, automation, these new technologies that have been deployed to basically destroy labor wages have been deployed in ways that are not actually increasing American productivity as has historically been done, but is in fact being done to destroy labor wages and effectively destroy human employment. So this is from the Wall Street Journal piece of Mims sort of underscoring here the effective tax rates for labor versus software and equipment, where businesses are incentivized by the US tax code to basically invest in automation, regardless of whether it's actually more effective than the humans it's replacing. This is something that's, I think, been known in economist circles for a while. I've spoken about this with Acemoglu, as I mentioned, and also David Autor at MIT, who's been pursuing this. And yes, they've produced various reams of plans that would suggest that we reform the tax code and try to close these loopholes that cause businesses to invest in what Acemoglu calls the wrong kind of AI. Now, at the same time this is happening, we've also seen this week that Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, which is a spinoff of Sidewalk Labs, which is a spinoff or a portfolio company of Alphabet, basically unveiled a plan to build a private autonomous toll lane and highway in Michigan. And also the Wall Street Journal reported here that basically Amazon and FedEx, or I should say the New York Times, getting my news sources mixed up. The New York Times reported here that FedEx and Amazon have helped propose laws in 12 states that would allow delivery robots like these from Starship and others from Amazon and FedEx to basically use sidewalks for free. This to me is, of course, very interesting because one of the long-going warnings that we've been sounding when it comes to the mobility debate is the fact that technology companies look at things like sidewalks and streets, public goods that are paid for by the taxpayers, and see completely underpriced assets that they can exploit. So it should come as no surprise that we're seeing, these very large tech companies once again try to lobby laws that would allow them to pursue their interests. And this, of course, ties into the ongoing scooter wars of California as well, which we'll touch upon with the mayor very shortly. This is a GIF here of basically of scooter riders being pursued by the LAPD. I bring this up because this is from a long piece by Kevin Webb of Shared Streets, who pointed out sort of the intersection of technology, policing, and surveillance. There's another story coming from San Diego, for example, of how smart streetlights had their cameras repurposed by the San Diego PD to basically identify protesters and arrest them. So this is heating up, of course, with various federal lawsuits filed by the ACLU and others about whether technologies like the mobility data specification created by LADOT to keep track of scooters are in fact unconstitutional under state privacy laws because of its potential for abuse by police and others. Finally, a few lighter notes before we get to the mayor. Tesla has once again proposed creating a sort of all-in-one home energy stack, combining its solar panels on the roof with its Tesla Powerwall branded battery in the garage, linked to, of course, your electric sort of autonomous vehicle from Tesla. These sort of solar suburbs are particularly apt in California. Again, we'll talk about it perhaps with the mayor, where under state laws, any new homes to be constructed now basically require solar panels as part of the state's clean energy push. So it's interesting to see Tesla finally go back to an idea it once floated. This house, by the way, this image is taken from the set of Desperate Housewives when Elon Musk once announced it. And it's borrowed from here to basically sort of demonstrate what these sort of all-in-one stacks can be. And another inspiring image, at a time when California, of course, has such trouble building housing, which we covered in our new Housing Solutions Live conference back in July, this is an image taken from Geneva, where the Swiss built 370 units of emergency housing in the middle of one of their parks using mass timber, and did so at incredibly high speeds. I find this image beautiful on top of inspiring in the sense of what can be done, not only with lumber, but what can be done when it comes to constructing affordable housing in relatively rapid times. And finally, getting to the end of this, of course, there's another headline this week that, that Ford is rethinking the office. Of course, we're going to see how cities will recover from the pandemic, whether people will return to offices en masse and keep up our commuting patterns, or whether we'll continue to work from home or work from anywhere. So it's interesting to me that Ford, of course, one of the stodgiest companies around, going back a century. I've been to their offices in Dearborn, some of them, and it'll be interesting to see them go from the 1950s to the 2020s overnight. But Ford is using the opportunity of the pandemic to ask employees to clear out their offices and rethink just how we will use these dedicated workspaces. Will they be places we only go once or twice a week to meet with colleagues? Will they be places we continue to go to work? Ford is going to be experimenting with that, as many companies are. And at the opposite end of that bed is Airbnb, which this week announced that it would allow its employees to continue to work from ever. And ahead of its just announced IPO, Brian Chesky, its CEO, sort of deployed this idea that the future of Airbnb is not in millions of travelers going to the same tourist-clogged global capitals like Barcelona or Venice or Paris, but declaring that the new future of Airbnb is that if you can work from home, you can work from someone else's home just as easily. And so thinking about how it's going to basically aid this permanent class of work from home worker from basically booking different locations as they float around the country. This strikes me as unlikely in any US future in which families have to send their children to schools. But if we also have a world of virtual education, all bets are off. And it will be interesting to see what lessons we can learn from Airbnb's data as Americans choose to settle in places like the Catskills outside New York or Lake Placid or other various rural retreats. And then finally, I want to end with this sort of stat from The Economist here. This, of course, is sort of changes in searches here to sort of show how our lives have changed over the last 5 months or so here. You can sort of see how basically no one is going out to eat, or no one was going out to eat for a while, as searches for restaurant plunged, but has slightly recovered, how takeout has boomed, how electric bicycle as a search term has boomed, along with bicycle sales themselves. And you can sort of see here, it's good to see that hair clippers has declined as people go back and at least get their personal grooming under control. So with that, I'm going to banish that, and I'm going to invite my host to come on out here. Chris, you want to come out from behind the curtain and join us?
Hey, Greg.
Hi, it's good to see you.
Yeah, I should warn you, in California, we still don't do personal grooming, except outside, which we cannot do because it's 110 degrees and we can't breathe. So I'm still clipping.
There is that. Well, that is a suitably dystopian place to start there. I guess, could you, for the sake of our viewers, describe what it is like? I have read the stories of parents on the first day of what would have been their children's school year, educating them at the dining room table by Zoom while it's 107 degrees and ash rains from the sky. And I have to say that's pretty much darker than anything I ever read as a child about what 2020 would be like. How are your constituents handling it? How are you helping?
They're all struggling. We're all struggling. And maybe over adapting. It's the pandemic. We had we don't get summer lightning. We had night after night of it. We've had extreme heat events that have unprecedented in their length. The fires themselves, the smoke, and then of course I don't have a fire department right now. They're all out fighting fires somewhere else. Our entire operations hollowed out. And yet, if for those who continue to have a job or some sort of financial support and have a roof over their head, there's also an enormous amount of adaptation that's going on, which is both encouraging and a bit frightening. How much could we actually put up with? And is this the road to the end where we're saying, okay, what's just one more thing? Now there's a meteor coming. There's a zombie apocalypse. And the urgency that you have to summon to be able to deal with climate change or with racial justice or these other issues require a sort of an enhanced level of adrenaline, which is very difficult to sustain in this kind of a context, because no matter how enraged or excited you are about anything right now, it's going to be replaced by something else tomorrow. And so it's been an odd situation where I think we're managing to a large extent, and yet our capacity to get to some of the root issues underneath these, or some of the larger threats that are on the horizon, might in fact actually be diminished by our ability to adapt more than we should.
Interesting. I'm curious. I mean, you mentioned, not having a fire department there. I mean, where are units currently dispatched, and how is sort of the regional response of this? I mean, I mentioned at the top of my discussion there that, we saw people leaving the Bay Area, right? I mean, I've seen that rents in Sacramento proper are up like 10%. You can sort of see that influx of people coming from there. So you have more people than ever, I would assume. You have people needing services. You probably have actual, perhaps refugees from the fires as well. Yeah, what's the population like, and how are you providing them services?
Yeah, we do. We have quite a few refugees on an informal basis in the city from the fires themselves. Our state doesn't have the capacity to fight this scale of fire by itself. And remember that because of COVID, the prison population has been pruned back quite a bit. Well, that's a major source for the state's firefighting labor force as well. So they have actually fewer firefighters than normal. So they've called upon all of us to provide. It's interesting. You mentioned in your news segment the managed retreat issue, and where we've been saying, don't live right on the coast because of climate change. And so, live inland. Well, now we have the fires and the smoke inland. They've got earthquakes, we've got floods. There really isn't a safe place. And I think it's in some sense, as I've been trying to grapple with some of these issues, and this is one of them, you always worry about unintended consequences of your policy choices, but you can only forecast and know so many of them. That's in some sense why they're unintended. But right now, you can almost see all the potential consequences of every choice, because everything is in crisis, this exponential crisis that you described. And so, the normal work we would be doing on managed retreat, as an example, or, as we talk about Uber and Lyft and some of those issues, the consequences of everything are so plainly apparent because they're already on fire, literally or otherwise, that it's in some respects paralyzing. But so the other challenge for government is that these deeper challenges require a lot of attention and political capacity to act, which is definitely much more of a challenge when, number one, you're completely devoted to the pandemic, or the other necessary crises of the day. But also number two, which is the communications and organizing and rallying function. So I'll just give you an example. My job, if I want to, regenerate places or take bold action on climate change, I usually know that's okay. 30, 40, maybe 50, maybe 60% of people are going to say, "Oh, I don't like that. That's too much." But you push ahead, and you get in fights. Well, the problem with getting in fights is that I'm also like the lead public health official of the moment. And those 40 or 50 or 60%, I need them to believe in what I'm saying and to not write me off because of my quote unquote political views. And so it's a very tough ethical choice right now, I think, for a lot of public officials around how to manage a pandemic and the role that you play in making sure that everybody gets protected, but also that they don't infect each other, and provide the kind of like very risk-taking, bold leadership that you need to on some of these much more fundamental, profound issues.
Interesting. I was about to ask you, what are your relationships with your peers like as mayors, but also, the state government? I mean, obviously the federal government is, well, they don't have very warm feelings towards California, let's say, in general. But I'm curious. I mean, obviously, against the backdrop of all this too is the fact that there has been no relief package passed. That basically the Senate is sort of starving municipalities and the states of further funds. How are you finding basically support in your peers or other potential other sources of leadership, I should say, and available resources?
Yeah, we've had to, because it's I think it's both that, there's a desperate need for resources from our federal partners, as you noted. But as we've said, okay, we need resources for eviction support, for unemployment benefits, for those firefighters, as an example. And instead, we've gotten sort of unmarked, federal troops on our streets. And the federal and what should be our most important partner in this work has been demonizing cities instead. That's whether it's California or any other state in the country. So we've had virtually no support there outside of the House of Representatives. But from each other, we have. I think that those mayors who have not decided to retire from office this year, which have been an unusually large number, there's a lot more sharing of best practices, a lot more sharing of resources. and also a lot more collaboration with governors than there often has been. So I think, those levels of government that are the ones that have to pick up the trash and put out the fires, like, we know what that takes. Like, unlike a senator or the White House, I don't get to pick my issues for the month. Most of the time, I can pick one or two initiatives, but 90% of my work is the daily grind of it. And in some sense, that set us up well for this situation. But right now, we don't have a choice. You just act. You deal with the food bank. You deal with the delivery. You deal with the security stuff, and we'll figure out how to pay for it later.
I was curious, what formerly unthinkable policy ideas have been put on the table by this? I would never use the word opportunity for this because it's far too tragic of a crisis. But I'm curious. I mean, several of your peers, for example, in California, the mayors of Stockton, Los Angeles, and Oakland are among the three that have called for basically adoption of universal basic income beyond the crisis, or have experimented with it. I'm curious your thoughts on this, or other programs of which, what other areas could cities explore here to provide aid to their constituents?
Well, I think one of the interesting ones that's emerged in my city and a few others across the state is the conversion, the temporary conversion at least, of motel rooms into housing for the homeless in our cities, but at a big scale, right? So the West Coast has had just a constant radical increase in homelessness every single year, and as part of the federal dollars that did come at the beginning of the pandemic, the governor launched a program in California called Project Room Key. That provided some supports for cities and counties to lease up motel rooms in order to provide temporary shelter. We have a lot of legacy motels from the period of highway construction, motels that got marooned with no visitors, and that sort of invented new markets of prostitution and other activities. Sort of before the pandemic, we had, I want to say, just under 100 unsheltered homeless individuals in the city year over year. We were one of the few cities where it wasn't growing, but we had about 100, and we would have programs to figure out how to house 15 or 20 folks in a project here, a project there. With the pandemic, and we said, well, if we can sign agreements with these motels and also clean up the boulevards that they're on, why don't we sign as many as possible? So we actually ended up opening up 120 units for what was a population of 85. So more units than the total population of unsheltered homeless folks in the city. And although I think our numbers are probably the strongest, we definitely weren't the only one in California. So the notion that was before, like, let's chip away at this problem a little bit at a time because it's just so big, I think was swamped by the pandemic, which was, no, we can and must do anything. And in that case, we're able to really respond in a huge way. Same thing on the local food system, which system wasn't even the right word before. There's just a lot of different providers not meeting the needs. But the connecting of, the rallying of, the institutionalizing of funding sources got us to a point where we're pretty confident that we're getting food to every single household that needed it, that was isolated either because of income or because of the pandemic directly. So I think what it's shown for governments and for our partners and for people is, okay, just go and do it. If we had done the normal process, like let's have 6 months of hearings and let's talk about it for a while, we would probably have done 11 units of housing instead of 120. So I think part of what's happened is it's given those of us that have had policy solutions in our pocket, waiting for a moment, an opportunity to just go and try it and do it and iterate off of that. I think there are also some lessons about how innovation and scale can work.
Great. Well, I mean, one of the lessons obviously that's come out of the crisis is that there are essential workers, but the employees themselves are often some of the most vulnerable and exploited. And of course, California tried to address this even before the pandemic with AB 5, which of course is its law that was passed to basically label all gig economy workers, or most of them, particularly Uber and Lyft drivers, as full-time employees, which of course has been fought in the courts. And it appears that Uber and Lyft are on the verge of finally losing these battles and have now begun threatening to withdraw service from California altogether, as they once did from Austin, Texas. I'm curious your thoughts on this, because obviously West Sacramento does not have a very large or mature public transit system. I know you sort of saw them as an interesting opportunity there to extend some of the services. I'm curious what you think will happen next, and about whether there's an opportunity there to create, whether you'll see what happened in Austin of there were nonprofit services, other local entrants came in. How can California make the best of AB 5 and particularly these changes in labor laws?
Yeah, this is a really hard one, and the pandemic really pointed it out. Because even though people are using Uber and Lyft for trips much less because they're not going anywhere, the corollary services through food deliveries and what have you have gone through the roof, and they've been essential for folks to be able to get access to to both food, but also other delivery kinds of services. And then for workers who are out of a job or don't know about their job, working in the gig economy has been an essential support for many of them. So this is one of those issues where the unintended consequences or the acceptable consequences changed in scale as a result. And so this was always a hard issue. It's even harder now. So we have a ballot measure that's coming before the voters in November, and we have a case right now before the Supreme Court. And that is what's driving Uber and Lyft to make a judgment about whether they move more quickly or not. I suspect they'll wait ultimately, the final irreversible decision, at least until the voters have acted. Longer run, I think on some of these dimensions we're experimenting with different flavors of those. So we don't have a highly developed regular transit system in my city, but we're not going there either. We're doing right now a publicly funded rideshare service with vans where they're covered already under AB5, and I think we'll see more and more of that. But it's going to be messy because some entire sectors will disappear. There are parts of California where an Austin solution just doesn't work, right? There aren't the nonprofits or the innovators or the app writers to do that in Bakersfield. Or other parts of the state, which are the poorest already. So, it would be great if the governor could figure out a compromise with the gig companies, because they're really, it's hard to imagine a really great solution coming forward here.
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to ask is, as I mentioned, you mentioned, federal troops in the streets, a reference, of course, to Portland and also Kenosha, Wisconsin right now. And then, of course, we're having this conversation against the backdrop. The NBA has temporarily suspended the playoffs after the players basically went on a wildcat strike to demand more action there. Of course, as a mayor, I know you're not dealing with this currently, but I'm curious your thoughts as a mayor of what will ultimately happen with sort of the defund police issues and also the calls to basically increase public services out of police budgets. I mean, again, not to put you on the spot, but I think one of the things that's true, I say as a former New Yorker, is that many mayors do not have the nominal control over their police forces, which are very powerful institutions unto their own with large budgets. So I'm curious what you sort of see. Is there a possible path of governance in the United States going forward of like how we can sort of reconcile, the fact that many police forces really have outsized influence beyond the scope of their civilian leadership to basically sort of dictate changes in funding or priorities?
Yeah, that's right. So, you said many mayors don't have nominal control, but they don't have effective control either. And that is the consequence of collective bargaining contracts. It's the consequence of state legislatures, which are even more frequently controlled by the law enforcement unions. But voters, voters got to look themselves in the mirror too, because the more conservative voters, like the police can do no wrong. The more liberal voters, like unions, public sector unions, can do no wrong. So you put them together. And whether you're a mayor or a city council member, you can count, and there's no possible way to win in that situation. And so, and that's become institutionalized even more through contracts and local ordinances over time. So it's a very, it's a very undemocratic system in the first place. It is changing. Some of these elements are changing, and the protests have made a big difference. And even in my smaller city, where we haven't had any police shootings, we just a month ago shifted a bunch of resources. We had a bunch of police officer positions that we couldn't fill, frankly, because nobody wants to be a police officer right now. And I don't, not to talk out of school, but a disproportionate number of those who do might be in it for the wrong reasons, right? If this is the moment you're like, hey, sign me up for that, this may not be the candidate that you want in your department. So we said, look, we have these resources, and one of the things that I'm hearing from my own constituents, we're not the streets of Oakland or New York or LA, but African-American residents in my city are like, hey, my neighbors call the police on me every other day. And, you don't know what it's like, Mayor, until you're having a birthday party for your 12-year-old and, armed cops come in and you're like, not again. And the trauma and the message and the power that's being imposed on them by their neighbors is severe. So that's not an issue of the police as much as it is an issue about the abuse of the policing system by folks with either racist intentions or the systems underneath it. So we are one of the cities. We voted to shift a bunch of that money over to mental health workers, social workers, and others in an independent division as well. And I think we're going to see much more of that across the country. I'm not a fan of defunding. I think most mayors are not. Even after the major protests in the U.S. On the 4th of July, I'll tell you this: mayors around the country were getting a gazillion calls from our constituents saying, "There's fireworks going on in my city, and I want somebody here in the neighborhood to put a stop to it." And this is the duality of the American electorate. And so the defund movement I think is not the right direction in terms of its, but the messaging is not wrong. The investments have to reflect a different portfolio. The other reason why I think a lot of other mayors are cautious about it, I don't want to have a police department that only responds when bazookas and weapons and tanks are needed. That we need to preserve the humanity and the social connection and the democratic control of the police department. So shifting all the resources to some other nonprofit that deals with people and then leave the police department to deal only with weapons is not a wise strategy over the long run. And I think more mayors are figuring out how to overcome the politics thanks to the protests of shifting their departments in some pretty fundamental ways, but we have a long way to go.
Great. Well, I have one last question for you. I alluded to, the fact that, the supposed flight from the cities, and particularly America's rich coastal cities, the Bay Area, of course, which, inventory is up 100%, rents have dropped 15% there. Napa Valley, the Central Valley, obviously I mentioned Sacramento, rents have gone up there. I'm curious, are you actually seeing Bay Area residents moving into your city, not because of they're fleeing the fires, but because they're choosing a way of life there? And then are you worried about increasing gentrification, seeing a rise in rents that steep, that fast? I imagine gives some mayors pause as well. So what do you think is going to be the future of California's cities and how populations choose to redistribute themselves in a world of work from anywhere and post-COVID changes?
Yeah, well, it didn't take a pandemic or fires or climate change to cause that phenomenon. And we've been experiencing it for several years now. Is folks who are actually, many of them are continuing to work in the Bay Area, but have moved up 90 miles to the Sacramento region. And I think one of the things to be concerned about in the pandemic is that the widespread increase in telework options that you also talked about earlier in the show makes it much easier for someone to live far away and continue to have a job in those areas and bring an income that folks in Sacramento or Bakersfield or Fresno cannot possibly dream of. So that the impact of that sort of gentrification of an entire region is a big challenge. Now, I would say on this telework question, because I worry about it, because it means that when we think about telework means less driving, it may end up meaning more. And some of the research before had shown that was the case. The possibility here, though, also is that the types of jobs that are shifting to telework, particularly what we're seeing with some of our big employers and the state government, includes a much broader range than before. So it's not just content producers and attorneys and coders, but we're seeing a lot more clerical staff and others that are moving into the telework space. That has the potential, and they are much less mobile, right? They're much less likely to say, you know what, I want to get a place in the Napa Valley, or I want a great place in the foothills somewhere. They're much more likely to stay where they're at because of school and because of pricing and because of racist covenants around housing and all of the other issues. So that trend, if that becomes one, the telework among middle skilled and less skilled occupations, if that does grow, the potential around both place-based equity, the spatial mismatch between housing and jobs, and vehicle miles traveled, we might see a glimmer of hope.
Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us. Thank you for taking the time away from so much on your plate.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Greg.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much, all of you, for watching this episode of The Big Rethink. We'll be back next week with our special guest, Bianca Wiley, and my new special guest, my son, Whit. Oh, coming for the green screen. Thank you so much. We'll be back next week with Bianca Wiley, who, of course, led Tech Reset Canada and the battle against Sidewalk Toronto. She'll be here to talk about smart cities and other possible technological solutions. Until then, take care.
Bye.